Good morning, students. I am architect Amit Inam, assistant professor at School of Architecture, Galgotias University. Today, we will be studying about universal design in architecture. We will also discuss a case study based on the concept of universal design. So before starting the lecture, it is very important to understand a prerequisite which should be available with the student. To understand this lecture in a better way, students should be very aware of some terms like barrier-free design or design for all, which are also used for the term of universal design. A student should be aware of how to create a relationship between architecture and accessibility, mobility, flexibility, etc. So the objective of this lecture is very clear. At the end of this lecture, the student will be very much aware of the definition of universal design, the goals and the principles of universal design, advantages of universal design, and a case study to understand user experience in the universal design. So starting with the introduction part for the universal design. A universal design is a design for buildings or products or environments to make them accessible of all people, regardless of age, disability, or other factors. In architecture, universal design means creating spaces that meet the need of the people, young and old, able or disabled. From the arrangement of the rooms to the choice of the colors, many details go in the creation of accessible spaces. Architecture tends to focus on accessibility for people with disabilities, but universal design is the philosophy behind accessibility. The term universal design was first coined by the architect Ronald Mace to describe the concept of designing all the products and the built environment. Universal design is a mix-up of three important factors or parameters in architecture or the product designing: the usability, accessibility, and inclusion. Inclusion means including all the peoples. Accessibility means how easy the particular space or the product is accessible to all the people. And usability is how easy that particular space or product is easy to use for all the peoples, regardless their age, their disability factors, or some other factors related to the lifestyle. So moving forward to the introduction part, there are 7 important principles for the universal design that are adopted or initiated or like kept in mind before designing universal design, or like when we are following the universal design concept in architecture as well as the product designing. These 7 principles have to be kept in mind. The first important principle is the equitable use, how that particular space or product is like easily or equally be usable for all the kind of users. Second important principle is the flexibility in use. The particular space or the product should be very flexible in use. Third important principle is the simple and intuitive use. The complex design can create some errors or some can create some confusion for the user. So the design or the product design or the space planning should be very simple. The fourth important principle for the universal design is the perceptible information. For example, the color contrast. The fifth important principle is the tolerance for error. Like if we need to change or redesign some spaces, how far can we go for that, or how easy it is to redesign some spaces. The sixth important principle is the low physical effort. The particular space that is under the universal design should be like adopted for the low physical effort in the movement or in the accessibility. The seventh principle for the universal design is the size and space for approach and use. The space should be within the particular size of the standards, and the space designing should be very much clear so that it is very easy to approach for the users. So if we talk about the goals that are adopted for the universal design concept, These 8 goals are divided into two different categories. The first category have the 5 goals that are based on the parameters of the human performance, anthropometry, biomechanics, perception, cognitions, etc. And the last three goals are on the context of the human or the social participation outcomes, like how well that particular space are socially interactive, or how that particular space is being used for the social participation. So the first goal of the universal design is the body fit. The second goal for the universal design is the comfort. The third goal is the awareness. Fourth goal is the understanding. Fifth goal is the wellness. So these top 5 goals are considered under the performance for the under the context for the human performance. Like these 5 goals can be categorized on the basis of how well that particular space is being used by the users. That particular space should have the particular space designing or the standards based on the concept of anthropometry of the people. These top 5 goals are also based on the perception of the people, and on the cognitions, and on the biomechanics. So all these top 5 goals are actually related to the users as a single person. But if you talk about the next three goals of the universal design, those are related to the mass users. For example, the social participation, how the particular area or the particular space or the particular product can be socially interactive or can be used for the social participation outcomes. So the sixth important goals for the universal design is the social integration, and then the personalization, and finally the cultural appropriateness. So these top 8 goals are very important to keep in mind when we are like designing for the universal design concept. So human performance, anthropometry, biomechanics, etc. are even important factors, and we have to keep in mind the social participation or the social awareness as well. Now, if we talk about another term that is being used within this concept of universal design, actually barrier-free concept or barrier-free, the term barrier-free came before the universal design. So universal design is not a fad or a trend, but it enduring design approach grounded in the belief that the broad range of human ability is ordinary, not special. So universal design addresses barrier faced by people with disabilities, older people, children, and other population that are typically overlooked in the design process. While we are designing, we don't look for these kind of people while designing. We actually take them as a user, but not consider these kind of different abilities of different kind of users. So universal design reduces stigma and provides benefits for all kind of users. For example, building entrances without stair assist equality someone who moves furniture, pushes a baby stroller, or uses a wheelchair. Universal design can increase usability of an environment or product without considerably increasing its cost by reducing the need for design modification later when abilities and circumstances change. So when the circumstances or the user interference came into the play, these can actually change the design. So at that point particular time there should be a need of a little bit of change in the design as per the user interference and need. So if we talk about the usability and the universal design, the relationship between the usability, which is another parameter, another feature of universal design. So when we talk about usability and universal design is not a synonym for accessibility standard. Though accessibility is a very important feature within the universal design, but universal design is a broader term. The universal design process differs from one complying with the accessibility standards by integrating accessible features, different accessibility features throughout the overall design. So this difference in the process is very important, because when we integrate these kind of changes, these kind of accessibility features throughout the design, the result is always a better design. Additionally, it prevents stigmatization, other often associated with the accessible features, that has been added on late in the design, or like after the design is being done, some changes are there, or like which is in the form of modification. So when we are following the universal design also differs from accessibility requirement, in that accessibility requirement are usually perspective, whereas universal design is performance based. So the accessibility feature is the prescriptive thing, and while the universal design is a performance based. Universal design does not have minimum requirement but instead addresses usability issues. So it's a very important thing to understand here is the universal design only have to be kept in the mind because we are have to follow some rules for the users, and while designing the spaces or the product, it's very important to not to think much about the requirements that are under the architectural thing, but the requirements that have to be faced by the user as a user perception. So these are some important examples at different spaces and different functions where the universe concept of universal design is adopted. Like in the first picture, you can see how a ramp is being included within the steps so that it does not feel like the person who is using the wheelchair or the person who has some problem in walking the stairs or the steps feel like are neglected, or like he feels like that those steps are not meant for him or her. While using the tactile plates, the picture on the in the middle, you can see the use of tactile tiles for the movement of the people with disability in seeing. Another form of user universal design is the adaptation of ramps within a particular closure. A new design for the which we have seen earlier in the video, the concept for the services like washrooms and toilets, designing for the new kinds of seats and wash basins. Even in another kind of swimming pool areas, you can see some kind of areas that are being used for the people with disabilities. So these are some spaces that have adopted the concept. Even in India, there are many spaces and many buildings that are now following the concept of universal design. So because universal design follows some basic principles of the some major important factors while designing or while in the architectural design, which has accessibility as a factor or as a parameter, mobility as a parameter. So obviously universal design has some potential, has some advantages over the other designing concepts. Universal design, which means that when we are doing the universal design or following the concept of universal design, it is a planning to build physical space or learning space or work environment so that they are usable by the wide range of people, regardless of their age, size, and or disability status. So when while universal design promotes access for individual with disabilities, it also benefits other kind of people as well. It is easier to plan from the start when we are designing with the concept of universal design. It is easier to start from the scratch, from the zero, keeping in mind the accessibility factor, rather than retrofitting something or redesigning something which has some problem with the accessibility or the space if the space is inaccessible. So regardless of your space, no matter it is a university, workspace, school, among others, it's always easier to design with accessibility in the front of mind. So universal design benefits everyone. So however, the potential for the universal design to improve the lives and work of individual and communities as well is wide reaching. So there are a number of points that are under the concept of universal design, but when we talk about some important points, these 6 points are some of the major important areas to be kept in mind before following the universal design concept. The deaf and the hard of hearing, the people who have a problem in hearing, or if they are deaf, the people who use the wheelchair, the amputees, The people with learning difficulties or learning disabilities, they have a separate kind of schools which we will discuss in further in this lecture. How color can play a role, how space designing can improve the learning of people with some disabilities. People with limited mobility, if they have a limited mobility, they have a problem in moving, or they have a problem in mobility, or moving from one space to another space, how can we design for such people, keeping in mind the other kind of users as well. And finally, the blind or the low vision, the people who are blind or they have a low vision, how can we design the pathways, the corridors, or how can we design for them, or how can we design the spaces for them. So these are some important areas that have to be kept in mind before planning for the universal design. So now let's move on a particular case study of an educational building, which is based on the concept of the designing is based on the concept of universal design. So the case study is of a school called as Furbush School, which is a part of a Shepherd Pratt Health System outside the Baltimore in Hunt Valley, Maryland. It was constructed in 2008, and it was an unused warehouse which was then converted into an educational building. So that particular school was designed for the students or children with autism spectrum disorder or ASD. It was believed that it was considered that the students or the children with autism spectrum disorder ASD has a different learning ability, or they need a different learning environment with the students that were a part of the Shepherd Pratt health system with behavioral health disorders. So there is a difference of learning stages or learning environment. There is a need of different learning environment for these two different kind of users. So the new school contains classrooms, staff offices, therapy spaces, and a specially designed playground to meet the need of the children with ASD. There were ramps that are incorporated into the main and the playground entries. So to give that particular area a good accessible feature, classrooms have accessible bathrooms and the rubber padded floors system installed in the activity rooms, so to reduce the impact injury and the noise as well. So this particular school in Maryland was designed on the basis of universal design concept, keeping in mind the learning ability as well. So if we now talk about the different universal design features that are adopted in the particular school, the Warbush school. So there were careful attention was paid to the proportion of the spaces for both public as well as the classroom areas. Ceiling heights and corridors width were increased beyond the code standard to accommodate the children's need. Bringing in natural light was an important feature of the design. New window openings are introduced around the perimeter of the building to allow each classroom to have a particular amount of daylighting. A playful pattern of circular skylight helped bring natural light to the common central spaces. Because children with ASD tend to be sensitive to the flicker associated with the fluorescent lighting, several types of indirect light energy efficient features were tested to select the most comfortable flicker free one. So there is an adaptation of how the user will interact with the particular space. The behavior of the user was very much deeply studied before designing the and selecting even the color scheme and the lighting system of the particular school. So the use of highly absorptive ceiling panels, quiet mechanical air distribution system, and wall materials that minimize transmitted sounds between adjacent spaces result in the acoustically comfortable environment. Amplified noise, echoes, and reverberated noise are minimal despite of the spaciousness of the space. The use of material was very much studied, how the selection of material was done, what kind of material is required to reduce the reduce the excess noise for the students with the disability of ASD. So the selection of the particular amount of lighting, the particular amount of uh, material or the type of material was studied before designing. Moving forward to the universal design features in that particular school, the space program was developed to maximize one-on-one learning and therapeutic services for the students. So classrooms are located along the perimeter to have the maximum daylighting and organized in cluster of four based on the age group. Uh, in a pattern of lower, middle, and upper classes. Each cluster contains therapy office and a resource room as well. So it was based on the system of one-on-one learning system, and the particular classroom are located on the perimeter of the building so that it has the maximum amount of daylighting. The shared multipurpose room, uh, or the sensory integration room, or the occupational therapy apartment, and eating areas are located in the center, accessible to all the three clusters and fitted with the skylightings. Administrative offices and reception are located near the main entry. So it was the main area or the main core of that particular school is, or the main multi-purpose area, where the whole group of students can accommodate at a time of, like, let's say the canteen area or the dining area, eating area was at the center, so that it is easily accessible to all the clusters which is attached to the perimeter of the building. And inviting, like, internal main street brings students and visitors in the front, the from the main entry, and helps organize the school with clear visual cues from the three learning clusters and shared spaces as well. The limited site around the building was redesigned to allow for vehicular movements, visitors, and staff parking. They created a secure playground adjacent to the school. A secure playground was created for the children with ASD, which is adjacent to the school. So, if we talk about the space management in the context of universal design for the particular school, the Forward School, this is how the planning was done. If you can clearly see that particular common space, the eating space, or that gathering space is in the center of the building, while the classrooms are connected to the particular common space, while the activity area within that classroom is in the center. The activities area are in the center, and with each cluster of classroom is connected to the laboratories. The two laboratories are then connected to the different classrooms, while this whole cluster is being repeated in the another format as well. So the color illustration with color delineating spaces for classrooms and laboratories on one side of the hall and therapy spaces on the other. So we have a different spaces on the other side of the common space. For example, you can see the behavior specialist is on the other side of the common space. The social work spaces or the resource route is on the other side of the speech therapist is on the other side. The classroom area, which is accommodated on the bottom of the or the front of the building, while the rest of the important features of the building is on the other side. And common space is actually following the barrier between the two spaces, which has the accessibility on the both the types of functions. So if we talk about the user experience within that particular school, the forward school, the first point, as we have discussed it earlier, how the spaces or the classroom, staff offices, therapy spaces are designed to meet the needs of the children with ASD, how ramps are incorporated within the building to connect it with the playground entries as well, how classroom are connected and make accessible to the bathrooms, and the spaces are fitted with the rubber padded floor system to make it more safe and to reduce the impact injury and reduce the noise as well. So if you talk about there are some conditions in the ASD where the child or the person who has the ASD is have a particular space of himself or herself, which is termed as proxemics. So this space proxemics is the person's space around the body. Each each user has a particular space, a personal space, which is called as the proxemics. While we are talking about the ASD users, this space is much more private than a person without ASD. So any external entry or any external person can be treated as a potential threat. The person with ASD treat him or her as a potential threat. So they need more space or need a more space to move on or create another kind of proxemics for himself or herself. So keeping in mind this kind of issue related to ASD, the spaces were designed and movement around the building requires space large enough to reduce the perceived threat, which obviously can create distress with the student or with the children with the ASD problem. Following are the references for your if you want to move further and want to study and want to learn more about the universal design concepts. These are some important references through which you can go through the different concepts, even the principles, the detail of principles, the details of the goals of the universal design, and much more case study within these references. So this is a part of your assignment. These three questions have to be submitted as a assignment questions. The first question is, how is barrier free and universal design concepts are interrelated to each other? You have to explain how the term barrier free and universal design are like interrelated to each other. Then you have to explain the different goals of universal design, and finally you have to explain the importance of universal design in architecture, quoting some case study from internet, or you can quote the case study you have learned in this lecture as well. So you have to submit these questions as a part of your assignment. So in the next lecture, we'll be focusing more on the principles of universal design in brief. This is all about the introduction part of the universal design. Thank you.